a transformational just transition agenda in Africa. So the purpose of this session is to derive proposals for transformational climate finance instruments, mechanisms, and strategies that mobilize finances for a just transition in Africa to tackle climate-related challenges. The second objective is to map a practical roadmap to overcome challenges for Africa's transformational agenda in attaining effective structural change and sustainable climate resources. So this is a very important subject. If you were here earlier, you would have heard us about, the multiple crises in which African countries have found themselves, and climate is one of them. We are faced with issues around energy transition. We are caught between two difficult places, whether we should continue with fossil fuels, right? Or we should transition towards the clean energy. But this also has implications in terms of mobilizing resources for African countries. This has implications in terms of adaptation and mitigation strategies around climate finance. And this has debt implications as well, which we can't ignore. And there is a very important question. How do we as African countries go through this transition process? Because it also erodes our economic base, considering the fact that we are resource-intensive economies. How do we get into a transition where African countries will not be at the losing end? Also considering the fact that African countries have been bypassed by the fossil fuel age. What do we need to consider differently? The climate financing instruments that are available, how do we have to use these instruments without actually getting to be at the losing end in terms of mounting debt and of course in terms of lost opportunities when it comes to mobilizing resources to finance development. And this is a very important question leading up to the climate summit, the African Climate Week that we'll be having in Nairobi in the days ahead. It is a very important question also as we are moving into the spring meetings, to the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, which will be taking place in Marrakech in the weeks ahead. And of course, we'll be having COP23 later in the year. So to have or to look at this subject and to, of course, have discussions around this subject, we have a distinguished panelist that will see us through, and of course with a presentation as well, to see us through this subject, for us to be able to share our views and, of course, enrich our understanding of this subject. And to have this subject with us will be with Honorable Gladys Ganda, a member of Parliament, Malawi. Honorable. And then we also have Emilia Reyes from AfCODD, Mexico. Then we also have a young, vibrant climate activist who is with AfCODD, Afshin Nazi. Afshin. Okay. I almost thought you went out. Okay. All right, you see, we are trying to get the gender balance to make sure that women get the opportunities, as we said earlier today, that since men are apparently failing to deliver, let's give the opportunity of leadership to the women, right? And probably they will be the ones to lead us to the promised land. That is why we decided deliberately to have, a good number of women on the panel today. And to set the ball rolling, we are going to have Dr. Dube of the Infrastructure Development Bank of Zimbabwe to set the ball rolling in terms of the discussions through a presentation, right, on this subject. So, Dr. Dube, you are welcome. So, we'll start with the presentation. He will take us through the presentation. Then we have a round of questions for the panelists. And then we go back to the floor, for comments and questions. And then we have a round of response. And if we have more time, maybe another round of questions before we close for the day. So, Dr. Dube, over to you.
Thank you very much, session moderator. Right, as stated, my name is Ngobizita Dube from the Infrastructure Development Bank of Zimbabwe. I'll give a brief discussion on aspects related to climate finance. I am the climate finance lead in our development finance institution in Zimbabwe, and I deal with mostly the national climate finance issues and how they pertain to countries generally in the global south. So I know the issue of climate change is generally an esoteric subject, but which is starting to get to the mainstream. And it is critical to highlight that when we discuss climate finance, we are mostly talking of general climate change management, which is split into 3 dimensions, which are the mitigation of climate change, that is the reduction of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the adaptation to climate change, accepting that the climate is changing and adopting resilient mechanisms that allow our livelihoods to be resilient to a changing climate, as well as aspects related to weather engineering and carbon sequestration. This touches directly on the carbon markets and the emerging climate economy. So what is happening? First, I'll paint a picture of what is happening regarding financing of these 3 major dimensions. Then we'll look at the role of CSOs in this space, and then finally we'll consider topical issues that are critical for people to understand in this space. So the financing in the climate space for a long time has happened through government-initiated projects, but then upon the formation of the UNFCCC, we started seeing financing that comes directly from climate-related financing platforms. These are namely the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and the Global Environmental Facility. By far, the Green Climate Fund is the largest financing space, and it finances projects related to climate change management, which we normally call green projects, using either grants or loans. So the majority of problems that climate change causes in Africa are problems related to the weakening of livelihoods. Hence, it is essential to push dimensions that allow for the strengthening of livelihoods or resilience building. So most of our challenges are challenges that require adaptation-based financing. Now, the challenge with adaptation-based financing is it's very difficult to realize a profit from it. And adaptation-based financing is very similar to development financing. This is the creation of irrigation schemes, the boosting of rural livelihoods of the poor. You cannot really get a profit from this. So most of the financing has been moving towards those areas that you can easily derive a profit from. And this has been mitigation. Mitigation, the reduction of greenhouse gases, is argued to be a global positive Because when we reduce greenhouse gases in Senegal, it's also a positive for people elsewhere in the world. Whereas when we finance adaptation, it is a micro space that is benefiting only the rural farmers of Senegal. Hence, we start seeing a lot of financing flowing towards ideas of mitigation. That is the creation of renewable energy plants, the creation of different methods that sequestrate carbon dioxide. And most of the people who receive this financing because of the technological gap are people in the global north. So the argument is most of the climate change that we have is a result of the industrial revolution, which was perpetuated mostly by countries in the global north. So they have a responsibility to ensure that they finance the movement or the challenges, movement away from the challenges related to climate change. Now, they committed 100 billion annually towards this financing, though it has not been realized. But the situation at the moment is we still see more financing going towards those aspects that are directly in tune with the global north in comparison to those aspects that are directly in tune with the global south. So there is more financing going towards mitigation in the global state of affairs in comparison to adaptation. What does this mean? It means that there is less grant financing and there is more loan-based financing. So the natural presence of loan-based financing brings in the private sector. So there is an inclination from the African Development Bank to the World Bank to start moving towards financing climate change management from a private sector perspective, because it has been clearly noted that there are chances of earning profits from this. So we start having what is now emerging as the new climate economy. And there is a lot of hypocrisy sometimes in this, because the very same methodologies that have been resulted in total environmental degradation are now being called upon. That is the market system to come and save the planet, to come and bring in financing that will ultimately deal with the challenges of climate change. But in actual fact, they are pushing the idea of profiteering. So there's a lot of profit being made in the climate space. And financing has actually shown that it is possible to make a lot of money in this, and I'll talk about this a bit later. So the donor community itself has got the ability to influence dynamics in this space. The civil society space can also influence dynamics in this space. But the question is then, how do we do this? Because of the entrance of the private sector, we have started to see a lot of debt in the form of bonds, green bonds, in the form of direct loans, being taken up in the name of financing green projects and further exacerbating the debt challenges that the African continent already has. This is because of the issues that I've already highlighted. There is profit to be made. So we have seen a number of critical organizations set up that include the Green Bond Underwriters League, that has been set up primarily to underwrite climate or green-related projects. And there is a lot of money that is flowing into this space for renewable energy, for instance, hydro, geothermal, and so on. In some cases, e-mobility. And we have seen a lot of activities happening here, and most of them have been coming from the case of private loans. But these loans find it very difficult to move into the adaptation space, which is the space that we as Africans are very much interested in. We are not interested in loans, but we're more interested in grants. Not grants that we're begging for, but grants that we promised and grants that we demand, based on the $100 billion commitment that was made by the countries that initiated the Industrial Revolution. But this money has not been coming through. What does it mean? It means that increasingly we are starting to monetize even the adaptation space, where challenges such as droughts, floods affect the general farmers, the general people. We are now increasingly saying we do not have enough money to assist you or build your resilience, but we're actually encouraging you to take insurance. Insurance against drought, insurance against floods, to ensure that your crops survive. So we have seen even on the continent global mechanisms such as the ARC, the African Risk Capacity Insurance, which is designed to guard against the challenges of climate. This has been celebrated. It's not that it's a bad thing, but what does it mean, for instance, for organizations such as civil society organizations? We are starting to see a situation where the small player is being used to subsidize the sins of the bigger person. This is a small farmer who had very limited impact in greenhouse gas emissions, whose crops have failed because of a change in climate, but we are not here to assist them because of the sins that we have created. Instead, we are saying, go and buy insurance. which is a challenge again. So we are increasingly seeing the small players subsidizing the larger players. And this goes further to even touch on challenges that we have related to other dimensions such as energy security. So the climate agenda is constantly talking about movement away from greenhouse gas emissions, which is the mitigation dimension. The emphasis on this dimension has resulted in increasing calls for the reduction of fossil fuel powered systems, fossil fuel powered energy security. And this is a bit of a challenge in the African space, given that we're already talking of a space that is inherently energy insecure. So the question then becomes, so do we stop producing energy from fossil fuel despite the fact that we're insecure, so that we allow and embrace the new mechanism or the new state of affairs that requires us to use only or move towards renewable energy, what we are almost calling net zero, which is the amount of carbon dioxide sequestrated is the same as that is emitted. What does this mean to us? It means most of the assets that we have had, assets that allow us to generate energy, assets that allow us to realize positives, and most of them being discovered recently, that is the fossil fueled power assets, are assets that could be stranded in the very, very immediate period. We have seen the majority users of such assets, that includes the automobile industry, indicating that in the near future they're not going to be manufacturing vehicles that utilize fossil fuel. And we've seen a serious move, even though after the Ukraine war some hypocrisy was noted, where closed coal-powered power plants started being fired up again. And this has made Africans start asking questions. So what do we do with assets that we have? Are these assets going to be technically stranded forever because we no longer fit into the global profile? Or we are going to be stranded into deals that utilize these assets, and we're going to be locked out of future deals that actually promote the utilization of renewable energy because we are seriously, strongly dependent on fossil fuel powered systems. So what does this then mean? It means that the process of the transition has to be well managed from an African perspective. This is what people are calling the just transition. How long will it take us to transition from the utilization of fossil fuel towards renewable energy? And in this process of moving in that direction, which assets are critical to us? This is a debate that is not being featured much in academia, in civil society, the availability of transition assets. Africa has got extreme amounts of transition assets, such as lithium, other assets that are also involved in the creation and manufacturing of batteries and other energy systems that are part of the renewable energy complex. These assets are very important. And how are we managing these assets? How much of them do we have? And if we're going to be transitioning and moving away from particular stranded assets such as coal, what is the duration from now up to the point of being stranded? These are questions that are not being answered. How many years do we still have coal? Can we agree on the number of years it will take for coal to be finally agreed upon as a stranded asset? And this is not going to be the same in all countries. So the blanket approach where we are being told from now on coal is stranded, oil is stranded, oil is not, is seemingly not functional. What is evident is we need a timeline that is going to explain, in accordance to all different countries, how long it will take for us to declare coal stranded, to declare oil stranded. And in this space, out of the assets that we have, which ones are going to be our major transition assets? Can they be allowed to use us to buy time in the transition space, to elongate our utilization of oil, to elongate our utilization of coal? All these questions are questions that are critical as we discuss ideas related to the just transition. Also, what does it mean to us when we look at the challenges that we already have in issues related to energy? We've got a severe energy deficit, and how does this work in the processes that we're already talking about? But it is not the end of everything that we see. What we note is that we do have assets as Africans which are starting to emerge in the third pillar of climate change management, which is carbon sequestration and weather engineering. We know that natural-based solutions, particularly our forests, have got the ability to sequestrate a lot of carbon dioxide. And this has been utilized by others much to their advantage without us really understanding what was happening. So I'm talking of the carbon market. So the carbon market is a space where people who are interested in polluting because of production have got the ability to purchase a ton of carbon dioxide sequestrated by a forest or by particular soils and so on. They purchase this ton for a price which is traded on the carbon market. So we have had a lot of verification bodies, project developers, standardization bodies coming to Africa to create these projects. Of late, we had a major project in Zimbabwe, which was certified and pushed by the verification agency South Pole. This project was supposed to, well, it is still pushing a lot of carbon sequestration in the Kariba Basin. From the time it was initiated to date, it has earned over 150 million US dollars in a space of less than 10 years. But most of this money was actually not seen in the local space. Most of this money just disappeared and went to the verifiers, and this is what people are now calling the Kariba scandal. But it initiated a process where authorities decided to come up with methodologies of explaining and framing how carbon trade is going to work. So carbon trade represents an opportunity then for African countries, particularly in the climate management space. It allows us to get to a point where we start using our natural assets, particularly the forests, to bring in required financing, and instead of paying back this financing using money and so on, we can actually pay it using the carbon credits that we generate. This sometimes is what we call nature-based solutions or debt swaps for nature. And if we emphasize and push this dimension, it could be possible to start realizing significant projects being initiated on the continent. These are what we call joint implementation projects. Joint implementation projects that allow for a project. For instance, if VW partner, the car manufacturer, wanted to buy a number of credits and they wanted to change the entire transportation fleet of Dakar to electric buses or Nairobi, then this would seriously reduce the amount of emissions from fossil fuel powered engines. They can actually bring in the buses at their own cost, bring in the systems at their own cost, and instead of having Nairobi or Kenya paying back this money, they can actually claim all the carbon credits that comes from this. So it's a fine line to explain how much the payment would be vis-a-vis the carbon credits lost, but the fact that we can now bring in financing and allow for projects to be created on the continent, we start seeing a situation where we are starting a climate economy that will be beneficial for the African continent as well. So I think to conclude then, it becomes very important therefore to try and bring these aspects to the rest of society. The role of civil society organizations is to distill this information in such a way that the ordinary person understands it. We have an extreme information asymmetry when it comes to the actual producers, particularly in the carbon credit space of these nature-based solutions. The forests are mostly owned by the general rural people who have absolutely no understanding of what we're talking about. They are usually taken advantage of by the people who come to develop these projects, and there is limited capacity in this space. So it is critical for civil society to get into this space, build local capacity, make sure people understand the opportunities that exist, and make sure that they have a voice in the determination of the prices of credits like these, in the determination of the issues related to the just transition, and in the movement of finances more towards aspects related to grants, which are more applicable to issues related to Africa than issues related to the loans and the general financial space. So we should generally move away, or rather in a space that is controlled, where we move the private sector financing and the public sector financing almost at the same pace, allowing private sector financing to totally overtake public sector financing will result in a full commercialization of the natural environment, and it will lead to the financial apartheid that we have seen in multiple spaces, and at the end the whole of the African continent will be left out, whereas the resources and most of the issues related to managing the climate are on the continent. Right, thank you very much.
Well, that was quite a lot to digest. And I'm sure, even sitting here as a moderator, you know, I am actually on a learning curve on these issues, and I must tell you, it's a lot for us to discover for the panel today. You have mentioned quite a couple of things, which I think I just need to highlight again very quickly in terms of loan and grant-based financing for climate, based on adaptation and mitigation, and what will be the proper options for us to consider. And of course, some of the commitments around climate finance that have not yet been met, the 100 billion you mentioned. Then the role of the private sector versus public sector financing, carbon sequestration, engineering strategies. And I think this leaves us with very important questions to address in terms of where we want to go, or in terms of the key issues that we as civil society, policymakers, and key stakeholders need to pay attention to in our advocacy work and in our advocacy messages. So what I'll do is, first of all, a round of questions. I'll start with Honorable, especially with regards to lessons that can be drawn from the role of parliamentarians, so from their engagement with climate financing initiatives from various sources. I know there are quite a number of sources that we might not name here. We could have the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environmental Fund, the Africa Climate Fund. There is more, and maybe just your experience with engagement on these various sources, and what have been the implications, if any, and of course, what could be the best practices. I think it's a lot to ask, but I think we'll just want to hear you, your experience with the various instruments and the implications.
Thank you so much, moderator, for for recognizing my presence. I'm not just a member of Parliament, but I also chair the Budget and Finance Committee of Parliament.
Thank you.
These issues are the ones that my committee do already handle. But before I get into the issues, allow me to thank Dr. Due for highlighting the issues that he has highlighted. We are in a learning curve, and we've also learned a lot from the presentation. Before I get to the question you've asked me, allow me to say a few comments. The first one is to do with the fact that in most African countries, we are suffering from climate change effects, and that's not a secret. Mainly because we do rely on the agriculture for our economies. That's why any shock relating to climate change, we are affected. And also, let me highlight this statistic that according to the African Development Bank Economic Performance and Outlook, Africa debt is expected to remain high. And as I speak, last year the public debt was around 65% of the GDP for Africa, and for Malawi itself, it's about 70% of the GDP. So as Malawi, we are also affected with that. And you may also wish to recall that, yes, Africa, we do contribute a little to the gas emissions, but in terms of effects, we are very much affected. And you may recall that we've had so many cyclones in Africa, and Malawi and Mozambique lately have been affected. There was Cyclone Freddy. In Malawi, it killed over 2,000 people. It damaged infrastructure, a lot of infrastructure, and it shows that the post-damage assessment that has been done, it shows that Malawi needs over $300 million to recover. So all these issues, you will see that at the end of the day, they will come down to having a lot of debt because of limited resources that we are having. It means we have to either to borrow or ask for grants to look into climate issues. Now, coming to the lessons learned. As Malawi, we've mentioned a few issues. Our funds that we have accessed. We've done green climate funds, we've accessed that, and also funds that, that are related with climate finance. But what I've noticed in terms of the assessment as a member of parliament is there is need for more transparency and accountability. Parliamentarians should ensure that climate finance initiatives are transparent in terms of funding sources, allocation, and utilization. You will notice that you get a grant, and those grants are specifically meant for adaptation measures for the rural communities. But for no apparent reasons, you will see that the grants are being diverted to other areas. And we have a case in point in my country where a grant meant for climate issues was diverted to other areas. So as members of parliament, it is very critical that we look into those issues and follow up. Because one of our roles as MPs is to make sure that we play a parliamentary oversight. And what we've done what is best practice is to make sure that the parliamentary oversight role is not just only in the Public Finance Management Act, but it's also included in the Constitution of the Republic of Malawi, of any country. I understand, I'm aware that various jurisdictions do have parliament oversight as in Public Finance Management Act, but it does help to have it as a constitutional role to do that. But besides that, there's another issue also that we need to look into, it's policy alignment. There is need for us as parliamentarians to look at all policies that are to do with the financing, especially climate finance, and address all gaps that are there. Another issue that is also needed as parliamentarians is because our roles, we have three roles. It's oversight, is representative, and also making laws. But this issue of representation, there is need for us to safeguard our communities. So whenever we are accessing any borrowing or any grant that is there is also need for us to do that. There is one grant that we have accessed, and the total of that is about $19 US. What we've noticed is the Malawi government has been asked to put in some $12 million, and the grant is about $4 or $6 million, and you call that a grant. If you're asking governments to put in something on the issues with climate, and you think that they'll get from resources that are getting from their countries, I don't think it's fair, because at the end of the day, there are no resources to push towards the grants. So as MPs, when these issues are brought into Parliament for discussion, there is need to look at the nitty-gritties. What is it? Are there the grants? Or probably there's an element of our own governments borrowing from any lenders. Because at the end of the day, there are no domestic resources that will go, that are mainly planned for for loans. We are borrowing externally. And if you borrow externally, you know the risks that are involved in that borrowing. Apart from just having debt distress, you're talking of countries that don't have much forex. As I'm speaking now, we have the challenge of fuel in our country. We've got the kwacha, but we can't purchase the fuel because of it needs foreign exchange. So anything that we are doing in Parliament, there's need for us to seriously look into the nitty-gritties. What is it? Is it a grant, or there's an element of funding that is involved? So let me stop there for now, and I'll come in.
Thank you, Honourable, for the submissions, especially with regards to the question. And one thing I picked on it is about projects, it's about borrowing, right? It is about the debt risk, of financing climate for African countries, and a heightened one also taking from the presentation that Dr. Dube made earlier, given the fact that there is a lot of market-based approach to this. Maybe we can proceed, maybe just to, before we go back to Honorable, let's talk to AfCODD. What have been the resource mobilization and debt management opportunities and probably the challenges that have been arising from climate innovations in Africa. Of course, the pro and cons of these issues is something that I think maybe you just want to take us through.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think that's an excellent question. I think the biggest climate finance challenge that we are having as a continent is the vast climate finance we actually need. Up to 2030, there's a $3 trillion bill for the entire continent, which comes to about $250 million annually. And what we are receiving from developed countries is a mere around $30 million annually, which is roughly 10% of the amount we actually need. So as Dr. Dube pointed out, we rely on borrowing a lot. So over 70% of public climate finance actually comes from borrowing. So it's quite clear that the climate change crisis and the debt crisis are inextricably linked. So as the climate crisis worsens, the debt crisis worsens, and vice versa. So the other challenge is the instruments we are using are not generating enough climate finance. For example, academic discourse is bringing to light things, issues with debt for nature swaps, sustainable bonds. On sustainable bonds, for example, academics are saying that it's promoting the global debt and financial architecture, which is already flawed, and we are continuing to support a system that's flawed because those bonds are based on credit ratings, which are skewed against the global south. Another issue with these bonds is everything green sounds good, green bonds, green this, green that, but is green really a good thing? Let's examine let's examine the real impact of the green thing. So, for example, green bonds, they are a fancy way of saying more debt. So the argument is that climate investments, the funds that are gotten from these bonds are generally invested in climate investment projects which do not guarantee revenues. So we are taking more debt, putting it into climate investments that are not necessarily going to give us more revenue. So we are risking debt, even further debt distress. So in light of these, it is my considered opinion and my proposal that we should be using environmental taxation more, because it is an untapped tool for the continent. Although we are seeing increased uptake of environmental taxation on the continent, there is still a long way to go. Then why am I arguing for environmental taxation? The literature on environmental taxation and debt on Africa is almost none, but there are some ex-ante studies based on a European context which suggests that in environmental taxation coupled with a decrease in income taxation would result in a double dividend by reducing debt to GDP ratio. So you would have both environmental and economic gains. So of course this is in a European context. We have to bring it home to the African context. And this poses the question of what environmental taxation should be for Africa. Considering that our emissions are low, we don't necessarily need carbon taxes. There are many different types of taxes. We can look at taxes in pollution, resources, energy, transport. There's a wide space. One of the pros of environmental taxation is the flexibility. You can impose there's flexibility with the rate, there's flexibility with the taxpayers, there's flexibility with the sectors, the revenues. They are so flexible, you can modify them and control their impact. Another thing is that not just environmental taxes, but tax in general is a very powerful tool to bring about societal change, not just for the climate crisis, but also we've seen historically, for example, after the world wars, how countries started using solidarity taxes, wealth taxes to rebuild. So we are in a crisis again. Why can't we use environmental taxes? Because they take into account both environmental and fiscal objectives. So they're addressing both the finance part, the debt part, and also the climate part. And because this is a relatively new area, I can give an anecdotal example. If we look at South Africa's carbon tax, for instance, The current revenues from the tax are 1.6 billion rands. With increasing tax rate and gradual phasing out of the revenues from the tax could come to roughly 50 billion. The debt servicing bill is around 250 billion. So just that carbon tax can raise revenues that can address almost a fifth of the debt servicing requirements for South Africa for a year. Now this is based on an anecdote, and the statistics, we can discuss the sources of the statistics. Another not anecdotal experience, but an experience that actually happened in Tunisia is the motor vehicle registration tax. So the tax was used to fund, the revenues from the tax were used to fund the ProSol project, which led to the increased uptake of solar water heating equipment. So the government ended up using less fossil fuels and saved $100 million. So this example demonstrates both the fiscal aspect, we are saving money, and the environmental aspect in terms of we are moving towards solar, we are reducing emissions, we are not using fossil fuels. Apart from that, another pro of environmental taxes is that you can control their impact. Because you can design them in such a way that the revenues go to a certain, I would not suggest directing the revenues towards a general fund. One of the main problems we have with environmental taxes in Africa is the fungibility of the revenues. We assume, we put everything in one basket. We're not using targeted, we don't have targeted use of the revenues. If you don't have targeted use, we don't have that controlled impact, this certain objective we want to achieve. Now, there are issues, those are the pros, which it sounds all good so far, but when we move to the cons, yes, there are challenges, but they're very navigable challenges. One of the challenges is public acceptance. So how can we gain public acceptance? It can be done through raising awareness on why we need the tax, how we are using the revenues, what are the impacts that are coming about, and it can also have an impact on investment. So the impact on investment is multifaceted and it will differ across countries and sectors. So it's difficult and perhaps even undesirable to give a blanket approach on a blanket view on how environmental taxation could affect investments. Another thing is regressivity, or how it could affect low-income households. So how we can address that is by recycling revenues to ensure that low-income households are cushioned from the impact. Also, it can also be done through the design. And then another factor to take into account is the revenue use. The revenues can either be used for debt servicing or towards issues such as climate adaptation mitigation, or according to the bespoke needs of the countries, or to reduce income taxes, though I do not think this is the right approach for Africa because of our tax landscape. Now, our tax landscape is a very broad conversation which could take time to get into, but yes, that's the general issue on the tax design. Finally, I think another opportunity based on environmental taxation is the fact that we could go for a regional solution because we have shared resources. And if we have shared resources, we bring our expertise from environmental ministries, finance ministries. If we can create an African voice, an African depository of information of how we're approaching the issue and things like that. But generally, considering that the debt, climate change, climate finance, all of these issues are interrelated, we have to consider that the environment and the economy are so inextricably linked, so we can't leave one out of the equation when we are talking about the other. We have to talk about them together so we get a holistic view. So I'll end by what Professor Wangari Maathai says. The environment and the economy are really both two sides of the same coin. If we cannot sustain the economy, we cannot sustain the environment. Thank you.
I hope you can hear my natural microphone. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's quite a lot, Afshin. A deficit of $220 million US annually, right? If it is 250 annually, and we're just getting 30, it means we are on a deficit of 220 annually. And I think this is a big problem, and this is where we start seeing another layer of problems on our current rates of indebtedness, right? Besides our development goals, besides the environmental issues that we have to deal with, right? Besides issues of energy transition, which erodes the fossil fuels, which are the basis of us mobilizing resources to finance our economy, is the issue of financing the transition, which is a very big one for us. And I think this is a very huge problem, another wave of indebtedness coming our way. And maybe before I come to you, Dr. Dube, let me go to Emilia, just to have a South American perspective to this, just to know what Africa can learn from Latin America, in mobilizing resources for climate resilience. What pathways does Africa have to learn, from the Latin American experience on this?
Thank you so much for this, and I'm very happy to be here in Senegal. This is my first time here. I'm from Mexico, from a feminist organization, and also super honored to be in this panel. I'm a troublemaker, so I need to make that warning in advance, because I'm not gonna answer your question, Theo, I'm sorry. I wanna problematize the notion of climate finance, because really, we need to really challenge the entire economic and financial architecture. First of all, just want to say, before giving more figures, that Germany and France alone are responsible of emitting more carbon emissions than the entire African region. So that tells us a lot about who needs to pay, and it's not us. And I'm counting myself among the global South. So this is why I don't think Latin America or Africa, we can learn to. We need to fight together, because the responsibles are the people in the global North, are the governments, are the private sector, but also the citizens, because they are benefiting from all of the extraction and the colonial and imperial dynamics that they have imposed on us, and they are very happily saying, oh, we are the donors, we are so good to you, and I'm gonna give you the money, but you need to be accountable, and you need to report on it. No. They are the ones that are criminal and are destroying life in the planet as we know it. They are responsible for 92% of excess carbon emissions, 92%. And we are talking about us getting indebted, us suffering the impacts. No, they are criminals. They are endangering life in the planet, and they need to pay. So this is why we need to return, not ask ourselves, where are we getting the money? No, they need to pay. They need to pay, and they need to stop in their extraction, because that's the other issue that we're not seeing, because they are responsible. The global North is responsible of 72% of excess extraction of material resource use, and 60% of that is in the global South, meaning they are mining, they are draining everything that we produce for their consumption. So whatever we have, we don't use in our territories. This is why we have a deficit in access to energy, to electricity, to whatever, to food, to water, because the global North governments and citizens, they're using it for their benefit. So there's this tension, and this is where I just not only want to challenge the notion of climate finance, I also want to challenge the notion of we are in a climate emergency. We are in an environmental and ecological emergency. We are facing an ecocide, which is not only related to climate change. We have 9 planetary boundaries, 7 of which have been exceeded already. We have surpassed 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries, and the 2 most important that will leave us to collapse are, yes, climate change, but the other is biodiversity integrity collapse. And we are really, really way over the destruction of biodiversity. And how are we going to get into a moment of collapse? By mining. by promoting mega projects, as the climate change solution is telling us. Let's do the transitions for the global Green New Deals, the Green New Deals in Europe, the Green New Deals in the US. But those Green New Deals, what are gonna do is to mine all of our resources, all of our rare minerals from the global south. And they are telling us, oh, that's the new big business. You're gonna get rich by extracting the lithium and the everything. But you know, that is what is gonna be the end of our ecosystems, and that is what is gonna deplete all of our biodiversity, and the world is gonna collapse anyway. So these are false solutions. The green transition is a false solution because we are not considering the extraction and of this capitalistic system that is benefiting only the global north. So what we need to demand not only is that they need to pay, because this is not only about money, but it's also that they need to degrow. They need to start reducing their energy consumption, their overconsumption of everything, and they need to shift the way they live. It's not us in the global south. The global south needs to transition into a post-extractive economy. And that's a big challenge. I'm not saying it's not. It's related to the major trade dynamics. So we're discussing here tax and debt justice. We need to include trade justice in the picture, because it is precisely what they are imposing on us. Oh, so now you're gonna sell me all of your lithium, whatever, and that's where the displacement of our communities comes, the murdering of our environmental defenders, etc. So their depletion of biodiversity. So we know all of these things because we live in these situations. I'm from Mexico. We have the organized crime in charge of everything, our agriculture, everything, and they are taking control of it because the extraction brings with crime in every respect, and that's what they've been posting on our territories. You know all about this. Militarism, fundamentalisms, all of those elements that are pieces, political pieces that are playing so that the global north can impose on us these trade agreements, and then when we say we're not gonna give you any more our resources, they come with investor-state dispute settlements, and then our governments need to pay millions. So there is a compound of elements that we need to see, but I just want to say very clearly that it is not us, the ones who need to be after the money, and it's not a discussion of money. They need to pay, they need to be responsible, they need to degrow, and the other element that need to degrow, that is happening in global north and global south, is the concentration of wealth. So we have multimillionaires in the global north and the global south. We need to degrow them. And the other element that needs to degrow is also the harmful sectors. So it's not only fossil fuels, it's also the luxury products that we know that the multi-billionaires are gonna burn the 70% remaining of the carbon budget. So it's not us who are flying, the activists, it's not us. We're not gonna lead the world into collapse. It's the multi-billionaires who are going to drive us to the extinction of life and as we know it. So concentration of wealth is a major issue. We have trade, tax justice, trying to see how are we going to tax inheritance and whatever. Yeah, but we need to see the bigger picture here, because it's not only about taxing them. A colleague of mine in Asia, she was saying, what, are we going to tax fossil fuel industries and we're going to take their money and we're going to leave them keep on extracting? No. And the other question that we have is that, for instance, in Mexico, they're extracting lithium. With the war in Ukraine, the foreign countries came and tried to extract the lithium. And they started to murder our environmental defenders. So for a big scandal that happened in Mexico, the president of Mexico said, we're going to cap. And it's not a nationalization, but it's like we're going to cap the extraction for foreign companies, and they're not going to be able to extract any lithium in the Mexican territory. So what I'm saying is that these type of proposals on capping, like if Mexico has lithium, are we going to just give them to the global north so that they transition into fossil fuels energy to now the renewables, and they're going to SUVs and to fuel their excess type of style of life while we don't have energy? No. Are we going to assess our fossil fuels and we're going to assess our minerals for our own consumption when we need it in a rational way? And it's not because we want to get rich and now follow the example of the global north. No. We need to assess rationally and plan how much of these minerals are going to help our population, and then we leave the rest in the ground. Alongside fossil fuels, we need leave the rare minerals in the ground, because we need to be mindful of the entire composition of the ecological balance and not only thinking about carbon emissions. So I just want to problematize a role, because those activists in the climate change movement are calling for green transition, green solutions, market, and transition energy. It's like, no, your proposals are exactly what we don't need in the global south, because you are depleting our biodiversity. So we don't need just a transition of energy. We need an entire rethinking of our economic system, our lifestyles, and again, to reallocate responsibility to the global north. And they are the ones who need to deaccelerate. So it's not Africa. You need to use your fossil fuels. It's the same with your minerals. You need to use them. And you need to be rational into how you use them and when, for what, and the rest, you leave them in the ground. So this is what we're talking about: CBDR, the common but differentiated responsibilities with the principles of equity, and the other systems that we have, I'm gonna stop here, are the proposals of cap and share. Everybody in the world needs to cap the extraction, fee the excess extraction, and with the money that we get, that is where the polluter pays principle needs to come. Everybody who's extracting needs to pay. And as the year goes by, we need to lower the cap of extraction so that we extract less, and increase the fee so that it is more costlier to extract. And these are other ways that we can find resources to pay for a transition that I'm not denying we don't need a transition, but we need a transition that is of our economic system. And it's not a transition in which the global south is going to put the bodies out there, as we have been always doing it, while the global north is living the nice life, and they're saying, and you are the ones who need to do mitigation. No, they are the ones who need to mitigate. We know that is very clear. This is the trap of the climate finance discourse. Climate finance is like, oh, I'm the donor, so I'm giving you money to mitigate. When are we going to mitigate? They are doing the emissions. They need to mitigate. Why is that? We need to live out of the trap and start making bigger alliances amongst the regions, and to fight these false discourses that are leading us into bigger crises that we already have, while the environmental ecocide is out there in front of our eyes. And there is no way, and we're going to stop it with our usual solutions. Thank you.
I was going to ask if you needed to take a deep breath before we continue. Emilia, that's quite a lot to digest, right? And I think I'll put this on top of the question I was going to pose to you, Dr. Dube. This pushback on climate finance. You just made a presentation on some of the mechanisms, some of the frameworks, some of the instruments. But this pushback from Emilia, from South American perspective, that has always, like from the 60s and the 70s, right? In terms of the development narratives, have always led this. I don't know, from your point of view, and considering the presentation that you made, where do you think Africa is supposed to stand with this pushback on climate finance? And then you also made issues around around carbon sequestration and issues around carbon market that have been promoted in the continent, the pros and the cons of it. We will want to hear, but before we get there, we would like to hear, where should Africa be standing in relation to this pushback?
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much, Emilia, for the case study from South America. I think the challenge that we have in this space, particularly beyond the technical expertise, is the lack of capacity. Our capacity to, first of all, make sense of the broader environmental economy at large. So we should be in a position where we are pushing for more financing that is related to those areas that affect us the most. But I think the individuals or the organizations that should actually be leading that space are not as many as we would like them to be. I know COP is going to be coming up. There will be a lot of participation in the civil society space. We're going to be, last time we were talking of the loss and damage fund. Now we're doing a global stock take. I'm not sure how much that is really well understood, particularly by the representative of civil society. So even if I were to say we should stand at this point, I'm worried that there'll be a few of us standing at that point. So we should try and have many more people coming to the particular standpoint that we have decided to take as Africans in this particular space. Right, on the second,
On the side of the pros and the cons of the carbon sequestration, I think.
Right, carbon sequestration. So this is technically not a new space. It has been available for quite some time, but the challenge is that it is again a space that is not well understood. So what technically is happening is it is a framing of the environment from a market perspective, where we are arguing that the polluter ideally is supposed to pay for their pollution. So individual companies or anyone who is involved in pollution ideally is supposed to pay a fine to their local environmental agency. This fine is usually very high. So in order to move away from paying this fine, they can go and claim that they have grown a number of trees in a particular forest that is actually sequestrating their carbon dioxide. Hence, they no longer need to pay that fine. So they realize that we don't need to grow these trees. The trees are already available in the Amazon, they're available in Africa. So if we can actually talk to these people to just keep these trees intact, then we have no problem of paying the environmental bodies, our environmental management agents. Now, what happened is there was a big challenge in certifying that for sure the trees were planted, the trees are being taken care of, and the trees have not been sold to mining company X and mining company B. So this brought in the global certification standards, which are the challenges that we have in the sequestration space. So you have got big entities such as Vera, such as South Pole, whose responsibility is certifying that for sure these credits are genuine, these credits are good. Gold Standard comes in to certify that these credits are good. All these certification bodies are from outside Africa. Not even one is really strongly working within Africa. So we cannot really talk about participating in this space until we have at least an African-based certification body that is saying this credit is valid, and because it is certified by us, it will trade by so much or for so much. The value of a credit is highly related to who certified it. So if it is not certified by Vera, if it is not certified by Gold Standard, then probably it is not going to trade for much. So the certification process is a process that is outside the continent. The project development process is a process that is within the continent, but the M&E and the management of the project is also outside the continent. You see? So we are not really participating in the major points that are going to determine how much we are going to get for our resources. And the final point is, after certification, these credits are supposed to be registered on a carbon registry, and then they go to the trading phase. Very few registries exist on the continent. And even if they existed, people would prefer to put their credits on particular exchanges that may be out of the continent. On the critical points of the value chain in the sequestration economy, or in the climate economy, we are generally missing. We are only very, very visible on the nature-based solutions where we naturally produce the sequestration mechanisms, which will be the forests.
Thank you, Dr. Dube. I'm sure there could be more disagreement if I were to go back to the to the panel on this. But I think it's time for us to just open up, maybe for the next 15, 20 minutes, to the audience. And please, when you pick the mic, maybe just your name, where you're coming from in terms of your organization, and to whom your question is directed to. So we have Ma right over there. Yes, you, Ma. Can someone get the microphone over, please?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, panelists. Well done. Emilia, I celebrate you. Thanks very much. I have two issues. The first goes to Honorable Gladys. You are my namesake. I am Gladys Branch, and I'm coming from Sierra Leone, and I represent the ITUC Africa. Honorable Gladys, you talked about the issue of safeguarding our environment. And at the same time, you made mention that funds provided are not utilized properly for what it is being provided for. Being the chairperson of the budget financing, what strategies have you put in place to ensure you monitor that this project financing that is coming goes to the direct funding, what it should be done for? What have you put in place, I want to hear, in order for us to safeguard the environment? Because in the environment, we have the women there who are suffering. They are in the street net, in the informal sector. They don't have structures, and they are out facing the challenge of climate change. So what are you doing? The second issue goes to Dr. Dube. Doctor, I hear you loud and clear, and it's been a concern. And Emilia has told us, clarified that when we look at Africa, we are not emitting enough to pay for the climate financing. But the issue is adaptation and mitigation. And you said it is so difficult for monies financing to go to areas of adaptation, which is our greatest concern. When we look at the environment is being taken away. Sorry, I'll have to be talking about women. Taken away from the women who do subsistence farming, and the lands are taken away from them from subsistence farming to extraction. They have to manage with the weather conditions. They don't understand. They need adaptation and they need skills transfer. So what's the alternative to ensure that funds for adaptation and mitigation is given? Thank you.
Thank you, Ma. Any other round of questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. Sophie Napo is my name, from Oxfam in Uganda. I'll stand up. I think you're trying to figure out where I want. Thanks a lot for the discussion, and pretty interesting, quite a lot to think about. But my concern around climate finance is the bit of tracking these finances. They come through in countries. I'll use the example of Uganda. Quite a lot is coming through in the country, and they say they're putting a lot of money in different sectors towards mitigation and adaptation. But you can't get your hands on this financing. You can't trace it. You can't track it. So you also lose the way of having the argument, because you can't easily find where this money is going. If you want to look at those most affected, maybe someone talked about the women who rely on the environment. Then we have refugees that are using a lot of the environment. And there are interventions to all this, but we can't track what this money is doing. And from the keynote, most of it is coming through as loans, maybe. So my issue is around how best can we track this financing that is coming to the Global South and be able to make our arguments better. Thank you.
To Dr. Dupe or to any of the panelists. I thought you wanted to direct your question to a particular panelist, or are you leaving it open?
I'm leaving it open.
Okay. All right. Maybe we'll take one question, then have some answers, and then before we come back to the audience. Yeah. Yes, sir, right behind. We'll come to you and to Madanya behind. Yes.
Over there. Oh, sorry.
Oh.
A quick one to you, Theo. I'm from Bangirande. Why are we not talking, therefore, about the climate debt, and how do we effectively problematize this? What's AfCODD doing to build a movement that can clearly articulate this idea that before we talk about markets, let's clear the issue of the climate debt, and let's repay communities that have taken care of these forests years and years before they were put up on markets that, as we can see, were only benefiting 2% of the billions that are coming up. So where is the climate debt as a core issue for AfCODD and all of us within AfCODD? To you, Theo. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, maybe just a very quick answer. That is the question that we at AfCODD actually want to engage civil society, right, to start having answers to these issues. And I think it's just last or year before last that we started on this subject, and we actually want many CSOs, in the economic justice space, to start working on this subject, because it's a very important one, which starts also with narratives, right? We need to start framing the narratives, asking some of the questions you just raised around problematizing climate, right? In terms of question of natural capital and artificial capital, your paper money and forests that have been growing for centuries and looked after by the indigenous population. This is something that we can actually achieve only if we start being part of framing that narratives, right? And I think that's why we're here, actually. So I think I'll start very quickly with the question around tracking and financing, which I think Honorable also to the question that was posed to you earlier. I think it goes the same regarding accountability mechanisms, to track and safeguard the resources to make sure that they actually contribute to preserving the environment.
Thank you so much, moderator, and thank you so much for the questions that have been pushed forward to us. Let me firstly respond to the questions from my honorable namesake, Gladys, to do with safeguarding environment, and also what strategies have we put in place to make sure that we protect the resources that are always limited. The first things first, you are dealing with politicians. Let's be honest here. And we might be aware that politicians would want to do certain things that are not in the interest of the public for obvious reasons, for thinking of the next vote. That's a challenge that we have. So to make sure that we cap their wings, you have to make sure that you have a good legal framework that will empower you as honorable members of parliament to do your oversight role. And in my country, what we've done, apart from just including the overall parliamentary oversight in the constitution, we also had to be specific in the Public Finance Management Act to give more powers to the Budget and Finance Committee of Parliament to do the oversight, because we noted that there were challenges in terms of oversight, although the constitution was, did cover it, but it wasn't specific. So we had to make sure that laws are tight, and so that if anyone does to the opposite, then that should be illegal. So my goal is to make sure that we have an effective and an efficient, an effective law and a robust one in place. The other one is also, we also agreed to do an enhanced oversight, because most of the time, once you approve a budget, whether it's a law with loans there or grants, most of the time is that you leave it there and you don't do much oversight. So what we've done this time around is also to make sure that we put in our laws for an enhanced oversight and be specific on when and how that oversight should be done. So that's another issue that has to be addressed. What we've also done is also to introduce standing orders, because Parliament is a house of orders. It works on its own orders. So you have to include, you have to be very flexible. If anyone has got an issue, if you notice probably that there are emerging issues that are not being addressed by the ministers, whether Minister of Natural Resources or Minister of Finance, there are standing orders numbers that you utilize on the floor to make sure that you get information from them. Another issue that I also want to address is the fact that the CSOs do help a lot. In Parliament, it depends on how the government feels on certain issues. If you notice that the opposition is in minority, the best way to handle issues that are affecting the people is to use civil society. You can take them on the floor, and also if you have a robust civil society, an active one, they do help. In my country, we've got like civil societies like Malawi Economic Justice Network. I think the executive member is here, and the executive director is also here. They do, and also we have tax justice members there, network members. I tell you, they have assisted us a lot in terms of handling issues. If they notice that as Parliament we're not doing enough, they do come to us and also make sure that they make people aware. Those are certain things that we do, and our own people that we claim to represent are not aware. So another issue that we also need to consider is communication strategy. What strategies are you using to communicate to the public on issues that are affecting them? Another issue is also capacitation. You need to capacitate your members of Parliament. Whether we like it or not, whatever we're going to discuss here, it will end up in Parliament. Parliamentarians have got a huge role to play, and you don't expect them to be, to know everything. You have to find space to capacitate your members of Parliament to also be able to understand the issues that are being discussed, to also appreciate that if there is no action that will be taken, then probably in the future this is what we are going to have as Africa. So there's need for the civil society to get into that space, give the information to members of Parliament, the research that you do, so that whatever policy decisions that we make in Parliament should be from a research based perspective. There's also another issue to do with the commitments that we've made.
Just maybe very quickly, just to round up.
Commitments that we've made. We've signed, as a nation in Malawi, we've signed commitments with open government partnership to make sure that certain things are not done, halfway, or probably, as I said earlier on, that there are issues that we, as politicians, we don't want to do. So we've signed partnerships with open government partnership to make sure that there is more transparency and accountability in what we do. Now, in terms of tracking funding that is there is need for a budget and finance committee of Parliament to be very, very active. I want to agree that a lot of funding is gone through various nationalities. It's gone through, some is gone through Parliament and others that don't go through Parliament at all. But you need to make sure that you track that. And also, there is also need for the CSOs to also play their role on the same, to make sure that they also play an oversight role and get the information. If I know almost in each and every country there's access to information, you should be able to get information from the executive arm of government and be able to track down all the loans or all the grants that are there. But you should know where to get the information from. So moving forward, use your members of parliament. The CSOs do also come forward to assist the members of parliament to make sure that we do a right role in terms of oversight. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable. CSO engagement and capacity building, very important. Yes, very quickly, Dr. Dube, just on how can we increase that's financing towards adaptation. I think that was the question.
Yeah, we need to have more continental bodies that are focused on climate finance. So we need to have more, the likes of African Development Bank clearly focusing on this dimension. Unfortunately, in the earlier meetings of the African Development Bank, the annual meetings in Sharm el-Sheikh this year, this was a major topic. But what the bank seemingly has already done is moved towards private sector financing. So we don't expect a lot of adaptation financing if that is the stance, but therefore we need to have CSOs clearly advocating to a critical institution such as the AfDB to ensure that we have adaptation-based financing.
Yeah, thank you. I think that also starts pushing us back to Emilia's position. I think maybe very quickly, just two questions, please, and very snappy ones. Very, very snappy ones. Yes, Anna and our comrade from Nigeria.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you to the panelists and doctor for that presentation. My comment, maybe which might then come out with a certain question is, I think as Africa, there are some things that we are accepting. Okay, I'll try to speak while I'm standing. So I'm saying, as Africa, there are some things that we are accepting which shouldn't be, and we should actually come out maybe with an alternative to this. For example, the issue of pricing or costing, it could be of our resources or something. I'm an accountant by profession. I know maybe my colleagues as management accountants, if they have a pen, you know how they cost. They cost the barrel, they cost the ink, they even cost even the cap. You know, we can all write with a pen even if without the cap. But are we doing that to our resources? For example, if we are then doing the extractives, who has actually determined the cost of the gold? Are we even putting the cost of the ground and the cost of then returning to the ground maybe for so that it can be reused again? But we are not all putting that. That's why, you know, it's always said, we can take your minerals, they don't have value, and they go elsewhere, they are, you know, shipped elsewhere, and then when it comes, it's exorbitant prices. Because as Africans, we have not come to the table and determined the right cost of our resources. So for me, this is maybe where we need to start, to say this is the wrong pricing at all, because putting it under a certain machine for 2 minutes, then you already say that this code is now worth 5,000, 7,000, but you have not considered the true cost when it is below my ground. So for me, that's where we need to also start and consider. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think that's a comment which falls within the dimension of the narratives, right? There was another comment or question right from behind it. We'll take our comrade there and ma'am there before we close. Very quickly, because we are moving into the next session.
Thank you for the opportunity. Comrade Eche Asuzu from the Nigeria Labour Congress. Concerning the concerns raised by, especially from our sister Emilia, talking about how Africa is actually, a victim of this whole climate change issue. I think it's also important for us to find a way to mainstream the argument for debt, management to the issue of the climate debt. It's important that we are able to mainstream the two together, because when you talk about the debt that we owe the Western, creditor organizations, what of the issue of climate injustice? We need to find a way to put it in figures, so that when we are negotiating this other debt, we are also talking about this. In a meeting we had a few days ago, somewhere in Dakar, I also raised the issue of historical injustice. So together with the issue of climate injustice, we should also be talking about the injustice that was perpetrated through slave trade, through colonialism. All of that should be put in figures, and when we are negotiating about this debt, we should be talking about this other one. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Camry. Yeah. Okay. Okay, let's go. Let's start with you. Maybe I'm just trying to reverse gentleman before lady, but it's fine. Oh, ma'am, do you want to make a comment?
Thank you. My name is Taba Mulifi from Botswana Council of Churches, also the founder of Botswana Stewards Youth Organization. Let me thank the panel so much for that information. I'm learned, I'm empowered. But I also want to know that, do we have policies in place when it comes to issues of mining? For example, back at home, we used to mine copper nickel back in Pikwe. So when the mine was closed, there came a person called the liquidator that we don't even know what that means even to date. He closed the mine, they say. It's still like how it was. The land is degraded, and I know when it's like that, it will affect climate. So what are we saying as African countries? We differ. For us, we have DBS, that even our president was questioning who is DBS, but he's the person that is leading when it comes to issues of mining, diamond, back at home. So what are we saying? If our president can say, who is this person, what are you saying to us as civil servants? So also, when it comes to such issues, what are you saying about the youth? How are we being empowered to make noise when it comes to issues of climate? It's not easy to come to forums nowadays. You have to apply. Sometimes you don't even get sponsorships for that. But where do you put us there as youth? Thank you.
Thank you for that. Maybe I'll just take this opportunity. I'm sorry, Comrade Abraham, for sake of time. I'll just give maybe in relation to the last comment or question, I'll give Shin and Emilia the opportunity just to give their closing words, since Honorable and Dr. Dube had the chance to maybe answer some questions. So you just, the two of you, for your comments in relation to her comment, and then we finalize from there with your last words. Thank you. Afshin?
Thank you, Tabang, for your question. On the aspect of mining, once again, since my background is tax, I will start from a tax perspective. I do feel that environmental taxes incorporate the polluter pays principle. So because they incorporate that principle, they create a price signal. So if you have a strong enough price signal, you can actually put a stop to certain activities. For example, the mine that we're talking about, if it's too expensive, if it's cheap, then they'll pay and they'll continue doing it. If it's more expensive, it creates a price signal, so it forces you to stop. On the youth in the climate movement, I am youth in the climate movement, and I do feel that there is space for us, there is space in academia, there is space in civil society for us, there is space in activism. I see a lot on social media about you see youth campaigning outside. There's a lot of information awareness that we as the youth can be doing. It doesn't have to be on the streets. It can be quietly through your papers. It can be through a blog. There's a lot of power we can, that our words hold, and we have so much, we have access to, we have so many ways of putting our ideas out, of putting out the information that we have. There's a lot of channels that we have as opposed to what previous generations used to have. So there are many avenues for us to put our voice across. And because I know we are short on time, so I'll keep it short. Thank you.
Thank you. I always like it that women have the final word. So this is perfect. I just want to say that I forgot to mention, so thank you Gladys and all of the rest who have mentioned women, because there are three main subsidies in the world. One is the one that Global South is doing to the Global North. The second one is the one that women do through their unpaid domestic and care work, which is women generate 60% of the value that circulates in the world. And that Hannah, is made through costing exercises, as you are saying. It's so important so that we don't cost only in terms of monetized economy, but the non-monetized economy is even larger. There is not enough money in the world to pay for what women are providing, and they're absorbing all of the shocks, including the climate shock, the debt shock, etc. And the third subsidy is the one that indigenous peoples are doing to the world. We are actually living out of landed air because they uphold 80% of the biodiversity in the world. If we have air, clean air right now, it's not thanks to our westernized societies, it's thanks to the indigenous peoples who are only composed of 6% of the entire population. So we need to really rethink what do we think are the solutions if they are the ones who are saving us in this life at the moment. And I think that is really important when you're posing the question of the costing, because it's not only the costing in terms of money, but it's the value of things. So this relates also to the human rights framework, for instance, the new right to a healthy, safe, and sustainable environment, but also a very important right that we are trying to uphold, which is the intergenerational rights, which is like the costing cannot be only about what you're extracting right now, but what are we leaving to future generations? What is our responsibility? But also in terms of the costing, there have been many exercises in terms of costing of the climate historical debt that global north countries have. If you have been emitting this such and such of carbon emission, then you need to pay this. And that is for the fund of the loss and damage fund or the green climate fund. So it's not, let me tell you, 100 billion that they are responsible. And we're not even talking about the other sectors like the financial sector, who is pouring trillions of dollars every year in investing in fossil fuels. So that is another segment that we need to regulate that we're not taking into account. So I'm just saying this type of, I really like the invitation to talk about the historical debt, the climate debt, and to make that into consideration when global south countries are negotiating with global north countries, because they're only having a very narrow definition of what is the cost of things, and we have a very different experience. And our experience is the one on the side of life, on the side of justice, and on the side of fairness. Thank you.
Thank you so much. But by way of closing, I'll just let Dr. Nzana just to make a comment before we just close. Thank you. I thought I gave two women the opportunity. Maybe this one, just one among three. I think it's not been unfair. Okay.
No, thank you very much. I really wanted to thank you, and this is why I'm taking the floor, to first of all thank the panel for such very elaborate interventions, and especially you, because you said something that called my attention, because you said that Africa and Latin America should collaborate, in this, fight for justice in terms of climate. Let me tell you that we are losing, and these are the data from the African Development Bank, we are losing not less than 5% of our GDP per annum due to climate change. And we cannot even evaluate the impact in terms of inequalities and poverty that we see spreading in the continent. And when you look at the debt that we are contracting today, you can see that it is intrinsically linked to issues relating to climate finance. So you said it yourself, that there are global commitments in terms of paying back what Africa and the rest of the world deserve in terms of their low emission on greenhouse gas. We are part of that negotiation at the AU, and it is part of the global financial architecture negotiation because there is a debt finance chapter that is increasingly mobilizing the attention of people. And for Africa, we are standing for justice here. And what we are saying is that requesting for climate finance is not an exercise where we are begging something. We are just requesting for justice because there is unfairness in the way the economic landscape is operating today. You said it yourself, and I want to reinforce it. The discussion that we are having on a just energy transition or all those issues are intrinsically linked to the development of our, regions, being it Africa or Latin America. Because, as I said yesterday, without productive transformation, you will not be able to raise the resources to pay back the debt that you are contracting, or you are not even going to be able to pave the way to structural transformation and to development. So, if you are said not to use your fossil fuel and to utilize the sun for industrial purposes, the key question is, can they give me an example of a country in the world that has ever developed with the solar energy? Just give me one example. There is no country. And this will not happen in the next at least 2 decades. So if we say today that we are even shifting to the so-called green growth and that we are not using fossil fuel, it means that you will not be able to produce the energy that is required to power your industry. So it means that you cannot produce anything. You will then be subjected to importing, exported goods. So look at the dynamics, behind that discussion. And these are the dynamics the African Union Commission is calling upon member states, calling upon the international community to be sensitive and aware of the implications of that. And the most worrying issue is about the provision of the resources. Because as of today, we are receiving less than our emissions. We are receiving an amount of 3%, less than 3%, it is 2.7% of the resources that are supposed to be allocated to the continent to shift from, this so-called fossil fuel to the green transition. We will never get there. So you said it yourself. The key question today is to know how are we going to stand in this dynamic strategic game, because it is a dynamic strategic game. Without sufficient energy, there is no industry. Without industry, there is no production. Without production, there is no growth. Without growth, there is inequalities that are going to increase, poverty is going to increase, and the situation will be worsening. So we really need to work together, and we will see how to take it forward. Another conversation that we are having with Latin America is on the tax, international tax reform. And we can also continue with the debt and the climate finance issue. There is certainly an avenue for us to work together to make sure that we have a common voice when we speak to these global issues. I just wanted to bring this clarification and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Lena. Thank you so much. I must apologize for, I won't close, right? I must apologize for my poor time management, but I think this is a subject that is very pressing, a very important one. That's in the formative stage, and I think this is time for us to actually get into the debates before we get eluded by the debate. So thank you so much for the insightful discussions, insightful comments, and for coming. And just by way of closing, just to remind you where we should be now, there is an EITI section at Venue 2. It's after the poll on resource-backed loans, the risk and the opportunities. There is a FarmNet session at Memo's room, which is just below this one, on reimagining, rethinking, reorganizing, and remobilizing for fiscal justice for women and girls, a glimpse into Uganda and Zambia. And then there is another session by Trust Africa in this room on illicit financial flows, the debt crisis, and young women. Then at Salon Ocean is the one just by the restaurant, driving equitable sovereign debt resolution in Africa, a model for global finance reform. So thank you so much for being part of this session. Thank you so much for the panel, for the wonderful job, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.